I serve as President CEO at Midland Area Community Foundation, and we're really pleased to have you join us today to be a part of this flood recovery call. These flood recovery calls we've been doing in connection with the long-term recovery group, and the purpose of our calls is to update the community on the various aspects of work taking place as part of our flood recovery here in Midland County. And to a certain extent, sometimes throughout the region, we touch on that as well. So we're excited to have you join us. We tie this in with the long-term recovery group, and each month we have a different topic that we cover. Today is a very important topic of housing needs and resources related to flood recovery, but we're going to hear just briefly about the needs that existed even prior to the flood. We've had a number of speakers over the past year. We've talked about FEMA, mental well-being, flood recovery for business, city and county housing codes. We've looked at your flood recovery dollars at work, at Sanford recovery, at Neighbors Helping Neighbors. We've looked at building resilience 1 year after the flood, a variety of topics. And I encourage you to go and to look at those. You can go to either Midland Area Community Foundation's website or reliefmidland.org. And there at reliefmidland.org, you can also view these past recordings. Today's call is being recorded so that you can refer to it afterwards or share with others as well. So we're excited to have you here. And you might be wondering, so how does this fit with Midland Area Community Foundation, the long-term recovery group? And we are part of the long-term recovery group working with many partners, including, of course, our friends at United Way of Midland County. So as we look at today's topic, and I'm just going to quickly talk through the agenda, and then I want to share a little bit of how this relates to our vision statement, introduce our speakers, and turn it over to them. So in terms of logistics from today's call, as I mentioned, we are recording today's call. We will be posting, we ask that you post questions in the chat section so we can handle those either during the meeting itself or at the end of the presentation. So we welcome your questions and encourage you to post those using the chat function here. We will be looking at the Midland County Housing Study. You'll hear a bit about that. COVID-19, some of the impact there, the flood. You're going to hear things around emergency housing, short-term housing, and long-term housing, as well as looking at the current housing market and next steps to address the housing need. But I want to set this program in the context of our community vision statement. I think this is very important for us to always remember, and this is on the next slide, just our North Star in terms of what are we trying to accomplish here in Midland County. And our vision statement is together, forward, bold, an exceptional place where everyone thrives. We know, though, for people to thrive, safe, stable, and affordable housing is critical for people to be able to thrive in their lives. One question that we hear quite a bit is, how are people doing with housing after the flood? Or how many people still need housing? I'm sure many of you have heard those questions or maybe wondered the same yourself. Well, we're going to hear about that today. And I think it's important to know that before the flood, our community had housing needs and concerns that were unaddressed. The flood simply exacerbated the need. And I think, and this was an important point that Jennifer mentioned just before we came onto the call here, it really opened the eyes of our community to the needs that were already existing prior to the flood. So we're excited today to hear on this session about the housing insecurities that have already been there, that have been additionally impacted by COVID and the flood. So our speakers today, we're very excited, and thank you so much for being a part of this. We have Donna St. John's, who's the Executive Director of Home to Stay. We have Jennifer Acosta, who's owner and developer of Jennifer Acosta Development, and Jennifer Chappell, who is the President and CEO of Midland County Habitat for Humanity. So welcome to all of our speakers. I'm going to turn it over to them. And again, encourage you to please post any questions you may have using the chat function. So I'll turn it over to you, ladies.
Good morning. I'm going to kick us off with this discussion this morning. We felt, as Sharon mentioned, it would be important to highlight the housing analysis that was conducted in Midland and in 2017, 2018 as kind of the the kickoff of this housing conversation related to the impact of the devastating flood last year. So in 2017, we began conversations in the community about the need to truly understand, identify, and articulate the need for housing and or affordable housing in our community. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, Habitat as well as Midland Area Homes, now Home to Stay. The City of Midland, United Way, as well as OmniTech were contributing collaborative partners to the housing study. Data from that study was contributed by the Board of Realtors, as well as the City and County of Midland GIS. We were graciously funded for that study through the Housing Commission, City of Midland Housing Commission, the Midland Area Community Foundation, and the Dow Chemical Company. Some important information on the next slide regarding some of the challenges that were identified in the 2018 study. Roughly 3,200 households in our community, in our county, earn less than $20,000 a year. That makes housing unaffordable at that income level. Rule of thumb is you should not pay more than 30% of your income towards your total housing costs. So individuals or households earning $20,000 or less really truly cannot afford much more than $600 a month in total housing costs. Low incomes, as we know, will continue to struggle to afford housing at those income rates. And the private market cannot solely adequately serve individuals at or below those income levels. So that's the low income affordability challenge that was addressed in the data from the housing study. The second challenge that was identified to address was the neighborhood challenge. There's an owner market leaving core neighborhoods in our community. Lower demand equals lower values. Lower values, conversion to rental, as well as a cash flow business model of those rental units. And that's creating a looming neighborhood issue in our community. And then the next challenge addressed in the housing study is the economic development challenge. Midland is an aging suburban. Newer housing is a benefit to our community. Preferences in our community are evolving. We're largely a single family home community, and there is a need to diversify housing choices across our community and our county. Now I'm going to kick it over to Donna to talk about COVID-19 impact on housing.
Good morning. I'm Donna from Home to Stay, and we are the Housing Assessment and Resource Agency for Midland County. So that means that we work with households who are homeless or households who are facing an eviction and at risk of becoming homeless. So when the stay-at-home orders were issued for COVID-19, that had a huge impact on housing in our community and across the country. Several eviction moratoriums were implemented during the stay-at-home order. Some of them differed in what was allowable and what was not allowable, but it prevented landlords from being able to evict tenants due to lack of payment. So this causes strain on landlords because they were not being paid during this time. So we saw not only tenants suffering from this, but also landlords took a big hit during this time as well. The shelters, the emergency shelters in our community also were bombarded with additional people needing to stay in shelter. However, they were discouraged from providing that congregate shelter situation. So many people, families especially, were moved into hotel situations to provide a chance for social distancing. The local response here in Midland, several agencies saw this kind of storm headed our way, and we pulled together, and the United Way, the Midland Area Community Foundation, and several agencies could see the problem with additional evictions, people unable to pay their rent, people needing sheltering, And so we pulled our resources together and came up with some very creative ways to help people kind of put a Band-Aid on the situation that we knew was just going to grow and grow and grow. Home to Stay manages several housing programs. We receive funding through state and federal resources to be able to provide housing programs for people who are at the lower income level. They need to either find housing or they need to maintain their housing. And that is challenging because these housing programs will only pay up to a certain amount in rent. And that's as high as we can go. Otherwise, we can't use the funding. So in this community, landlords know that they can get higher rents because there is such a need for housing. So it's hard to find that housing that fits within a budget that doesn't have a lot of income. We also saw a lot of housing choice vouchers coming into our community as a result of COVID-19 and the need. And that is another challenge because with the housing choice vouchers, only rent up to a certain amount can be paid in those vouchers. So again, a lot of landlords don't want to participate with those vouchers. So it really limits the number of housing rental units that would be available. So it's all impacted whether people are homeless and needing housing, whether they are facing an eviction and could lose their housing, or those who are looking for housing because they were flood impacted. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So when the flood occurred, we saw a need for emergency housing as well as short-term housing and then eventually long-term housing. Emergency housing was needed for folks who were displaced from their homes due to the flood either damaging or destroying their home. And a lot of those families went to hotels to get that emergency housing and were assisted through the American Red Cross. Some of them went to live with family or friends or wherever they could find assistance. Some even went to the emergency shelter here in town for that housing where they would need maybe a few days or maybe a few weeks. However, many people were not able to return to their homes due to the damage. Several rental units were completely destroyed. So not only were homeowners displaced, but also renters were displaced. So then we moved into a need for short-term housing. It was going to be longer than just a few days or a few weeks, but it could be needed for maybe months, or we're even looking now at a full year of short-term housing assistance needed, especially for people who are still getting their house worked on or completely rebuilding a new house, or those renters who needed to find a long-term rental unit and they're still looking for those long-term rental units because there just aren't enough available.
So this is a slide I received from Habitat for Humanity International. I thought it really depicted moving from emergency to early recovery to long-term recovery, and really reiterates and reinforces how the long-term recovery group has continued to address not only the housing issues in our community related to the flood, but other areas such as the early debris removal and cleanup, information and technical assistance, financial support, all of that. And it really shows that it is a continuum of our work, as Donna highlighted on the previous slide, of the emergency response, the FEMA declaration, then moving into early recovery. And now, a year post impact, we're transitioning or have transitioned into the long-term recovery aspect.
So as I talked about those emergency housing needs, those short-term needs for having a roof over their head, there was a time period, a slight delay in getting services to people who needed them. So the community once again stepped up in the flood situation, similar to the way they stepped up in the COVID-19 pandemic. and saw that, that people needed help right away. And we were waiting for the FEMA declaration. We were waiting for the disaster case managers to get onboarded. And people just pulled together, organizations, individuals in the community pulled together to provide some assistance to those homeowners and as well as renters. So the United Way of Midland and the Midland Area Community Foundation put resources toward helping households find a rental, whether it was a short-term rental, long-term rental. They pulled money together to help with that rent assistance, as well as provided money for Home to Stay to be able to provide a case manager to help people in this process, to find those short-term rentals, to coordinate their repair needs on their homes. And we also have still today have several people who are staying in hotels because we couldn't find those short-term rentals for them. They couldn't find short-term rentals. Their house is still being worked on, or they're looking for a long-term rental. And so they're still in a motel stay. So Home to Stay was able to use those funds from the United Way and Midland Area Community Foundation to coordinate those resources for those households. We focused on providing rental assistance and case management, and we also were able to help with water restoration because many wells went dry due to the flooding, or the water table was low and people were starting to get dirt and odor coming into their pipes. And so for those households who were able to hook up to city water, we were able to help them with that process. And it's a very expensive process. So the economic burden on them was able to be lightened somewhat by providing that assistance for them. The United Way pulled together a long-term recovery group made up of several organizations and individuals in the community. And out of that long-term recovery group, it was broken up into subcommittees. And the short-term housing subcommittee started meeting to look at these needs for rentals and people staying in the motels and their homes being worked on. Disaster case managers started getting onboarded and hit the ground running. And so these subcommittees started meeting, and as the short-term housing subcommittee started meeting on a weekly basis, we saw that there was the short-term housing needs as well as long-term housing needs, and they seemed to be going in two different directions. So we made the decision to divide that committee into short-term and long-term housing subcommittees. So the short-term housing subcommittee started meeting weekly and then transitioned to bi-weekly and then eventually monthly, because those short-term housing needs started to decrease as people were starting to move back into their homes, as renters were finding long-term rental units. The need for that short-term housing is starting to decrease, but then we're continuing to have the same housing issues, the same need for affordable housing that we had previous to COVID, that we had previous to the flood. They still exist. We still have people who are homeless, people who are facing eviction, as well as the flood impacted families who are still needing housing, and that's gonna continue. We've just kind of hit this bump in the road. But it's not over. I think the next slide is a duplicate. There we go. So in this short-term housing that we were able to provide during or after the flood with the Midland Area Community Foundation and United Way funding, 33 households were served with rent assistance, and that was about 76 individuals, including adults and children. 67 households were served with water restoration assistance. And that was 149 individuals, children and adults. And that included not only being able to help people hook up to city water if it was available to them, but for those households who didn't have city water available to them, we were able to help them drill a new well or repair a well. We also helped a couple of families with some septic issues with that funding. Midland's Open Door, Salvation Army, and other organizations in the community also assisted with rent assistance and case management during this process. They were also part of the short-term housing subcommittee, and Days Inn in Midland, as well as I think it's Best Western, they opened their doors to flood impacted households and provided monthly rates at a much reduced cost for households impacted by the flooding. So that has been really helpful, as there were not enough rental units available to provide the short-term housing need for households. And so that assistance through those two motels has been really, really helpful.
Hi everyone, I am Jennifer Acosta. I've been serving on the Long-Term Housing Committee and co-chairing that with Jen Chappell. I've also been and worked with Donna on the Short-Term Housing Committee early on in the process. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Long-Term Housing Subcommittee and how we were formed and what the goals are. So we formed in October of 2020 as we really started to see that shift, like Donna mentioned, from the shorter term and the more emergent needs into really looking at that long-term repair and replacement component. So the purpose of our group is to identify the needs and the solutions for flood impacted long-term housing across Midland County. And, our goal is to really help anyone that was flood impacted. So helping them by creating this robust database of what are the needs, what are they facing, and what approaches have been pursued, and potential opportunities are in place for homeowners. And also looking at renter loss and replacement, right? Not everyone owns their home and had a traditional home to rebuild, but if you lost your apartment or something like that, what funds are available, what opportunities are available, and what do they need as well for permanent housing. So in working with public, private, non-for-profit agencies to identify and pursue long-term funding solutions for permanent housing. Slide, please. So our committee was rather large. Like I said, we're really looking at identifying both needs and solutions for people. So we had a really great pull of having a lawyer that's been volunteering in housing for many years in our community, bankers, realtors, real estate developer, insurance, the city's planning department, the village president in Sanford, Sanford Strong CEO. We had representation from Four Lakes Task Force, from the Midland Business Alliance, from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and of course from FEMA. And then our disaster care managers and case managers were always present to talk about those community needs. So I'm not sure if anyone's seen this data in the past. I'm sure it's kind of been out there, so I'm going to just kind of touch on it briefly. This is from the executive summary. The definitions that are in here regarding, displaced and whether things were minor, moderate, major, destroyed for homeowners, that was determined by FEMA case management. So it wasn't anything that was necessarily local. We worked with the data that we had from FEMA, and we absolutely trust disaster experts to go ahead and make these determinations based on their expertise. So when we were looking at this in November of 2020, we had 25 people in short-term housing. We had 639 that were not displaced. There was a lot of undefined, if you try and reach someone and maybe they're not answering, or they're not interested in participating in the process, that's something that we can't control. So, you reach out to them at a certain amount and assume that they're kind of, if they need us, that they know how to get a hold of us. And then also looking at, we had 374 people that were displaced from their primary residence. So the self-reported damage, as you can see, between August and November did shift over time. And it develops as people are working through that process with everyone. So we're looking at, November 6th, around the time we started, that we had 155 completely destroyed homes according to this data. Slide, please. And then this is a breakdown by location. So you have affected, and then which would be like our larger capture, minor, major, destroyed, and then our total numbers. So for Midland in particular, we were looking at 22 affected homes, 310 minor, 376 major, 207 destroyed, for a total of 915 residences that experienced damage. And for Sanford, that would be 12 affected, 116 with minor damage, 127 with major damage, and 78 destroyed. Which 333 for a very small population and small size of the city of Sanford is very impactful. Slide, please. So as we looked at the data, this is now, we're fast forwarding to April 2021, and we've gone through kind of these assessments, the intake, the estimated amount of homes that need assistance, and then we're looking at the dollars required and the unmet needs on those dollars, right? So this is a capture of kind of where things stand more recently, and the available funds that we've had available. And then we still have over $53 million in unmet needs. Again, this is data later on in April now. So our total unmet housing need is kind of captured there in the bottom corner. And as we look through, a lot of it's been, we took the SEVs on the tax data. So we kind of looked at, what is that value loss to the community? What is that value loss based on the damage level, and estimated what the impact has been to the community for housing. And I'll just kind of, echo or remind, one of the reasons that we're looking at the financial impact of this is because homeownership is such a personal investment that people carry a lot of their wealth and their equity in. So it's really important to families and individuals' personal financials on what that permanent residence looks like for them and how that kind of affects our community as a whole. Slide, please. So our committee, as we pulled together all of this information, as we were looking at the data and the numbers, it was our goal to really provide case management with the best resources possible. Obviously, they had a lot of resources at their fingertips already, but really digging through and thinking about, how do we look at the programs that are available, the funding assistance that's available that really fits like our community's needs. And these programs were identified. So FEMA funding and FEMA relief, of course, and then FEMA goes along with the Small Business Alliance, or the SBA. And then the USDA has two separate homes. One is a direct lending program, and the other one is a home repair program. So the 502 and the 504. These resources can be, I believe they'll be available on the Community Foundation's website, so there's no need to try and record or write this down. And you can also always call case management, and they'll be sure to help you through this. And then there's also the MISHDA modular program, which is a little bit more niche in that it's a state program that builds like factory delivered housing, and it tends to correlate though with employment needs. So it kind of needs to be related to a workforce need where there's no workforce housing for a given community. Then there's also HUD mortgage insurance program. Slide. So moving forward, there's a housing task force for Midland that's still actively looking to support and create more housing, because as we talked about in the beginning, the need for housing across the community has been present for a number of years, and it's just been kind of exacerbated by the dam failure of 2020. City center development, and there's also a new development that's occurring there, which is low moderate income housing, workforce housing. There's Habitat for Humanity's building a new multifamily within the area. And obviously we have our flood recovery efforts and our case managers to help people repair their homes and rebuild where they're at. There's also the state eviction moratorium funding, which Home to Stay and Donna St. John and case management can really help connect individuals with as we continue to move forward. So as we move to questions, I would like to just take one quick second to thank both Jennifer Chappell and Donna St. John for all of their work in really leading these efforts over the last year. It's been a lot of work, I think, for everyone, and their leadership and compassion through the process has been amazing, as well as the case managers that are on the line with us today. You know, working through the red tape and the programs when you're also, you know, working directly with homeowners and people that have been impacted by disaster, and they're looking for their permanent residence, and they probably did not have a great night's sleep. And to be able to kind of walk them through this difficult process over the last year has really been a massive undertaking, and I'm so grateful that our community has their time and effort and care and consideration through this process. So I think we'll move to questions. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you, Jennifer, Jen, and Don. I really appreciate that. One question that was raised in chat, and again, I encourage you with additional questions, please post those in the chat function, was from the housing study. You commented on the owner market is leaving core neighborhoods. Could you elaborate on that a bit more, Jennifer?
Absolutely. That's a great question. When the housing study consultants were visiting the community, you know, one of the data sets that they were looking at was coming off from the housing bubble burst in the late 2000s. And, you know, through the, you know, for example, one of the examples they used is, you know, a younger family purchasing you know, their first time starter home. And over the years, as they, you know, grow in their careers, they're looking for their second home. And during that market of the crash, they didn't, a lot of what we saw was people not being able to sell that starter home. And those starter homes essentially turning into and converting into rental units. So the owner market leaving the core of those neighborhoods and those housing units turning into rentals, and with all due respect, turning into our kind of de facto affordable housing in our community. Great question.
Yeah, another question that came up based on the chart that you shared with 55 million in needs that were uncovered and only 2 million available. Where and what sources are practical to find additional funds for this?
So that's a great, and I'm gonna play off Jen as well. That's a great question. One of the things that I think needs to be noted is there has been such an abundance of leveraging resources that have been donated to support the long-term disaster recovery. So I don't have the actual accurate data. I think Sharon or Emily might have on how much was raised altogether between the United Way of Midland Counties flood recovery, as well as the fund at the Community Foundation. It truly shows that there is a huge need in our community of not only replacing those housing units, but the loss, as Jen had mentioned, and the impact that those units are no longer producing property tax value. I'll hand it over to Jen to build off that if she has anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add that that was absolutely one of the reasons that the long-term housing recovery group really looked at additional resources and federal programs and state programs, and we cast such a wide net to really include various partners within our committee, is so that we could identify as many available resources across the board as possible, because we know that it's too much to ask for in terms of a local lift, that we really do need to maximize resources and get them in the hands of people that can apply for additional funds and additional programs that are out there.
And to the question too of the 5 million roughly raised in the community, we're continuing to deploy that through working with the disaster case managers, working with the financial support committee. So that's an ongoing process, but I appreciate, you're right, the leveraging that's taken place, the additional resources that have been able to be brought in a variety of ways are really critical for the continued recovery in this community. Other questions? And I'll just pose one. I know you had talked about some of in one of the slides near the end, some of the ongoing work taking place as we move forward. Is there anything that you'd want to just elaborate on a little more in terms of what you hope to see, or some of the things that you believe are on the horizon?
Jen, you want to jump in on things that are on the horizon? I feel like you're always more in touch and in tune with everything.
There's a lot of various different activities, as Jen highlighted, going on in the community. The Center City development that she spoke of, really one of the things I was proud to hear about with that development and that proposal was the developers really listened to the data and the research in the housing study to really develop their units to address the need in our community. So I was pleased to hear that. Habitat, we are introducing and adding multifamily housing units to our existing housing programs, such as our single family homes. That was largely in response to the housing study. When the housing study basically came out and said Midland is a predominantly single family home community, and there needed to be a diversification of housing options and opportunities, our organization felt it was important to listen to that data as a lead collaborator in that study. We will continue to build single family homes, but we're adding multifamily housing products and ownership opportunities to our community as well. And various different other, public opportunities as well. I know there's a lot of various different needs in the community. And as it was pointed out in the housing study, both the public and nonprofit need to, are going to need to work together and independently to help address the need in our community.
I would just add that there is a big eviction diversion grant that Home to Stay is managing. So households who are facing eviction, who have very large rental arrears, should contact Home to Stay. This program can also assist with utilities. The people who are behind on utilities, we can also assist with that. So please send people our way who may be in a housing crisis and may be at risk of losing their home. I know that the community is really, really looking at creative ways to try to come up with more affordable housing opportunities in the community. So that's encouraging that it has a lot of attention right now. So I think that things will start moving in the right direction.
Great, thank you. And Donna, you mentioned a significant grant. Could you just give an indication of approximately how much you anticipate coming to the community, just to give those that are listening a sense of the resources that may be available?
So this grant is called the SARA program. It's CERA, it's COVID Emergency Rental Assistance. Midland County received almost $2 million to provide rental assistance, utility assistance, case management services. It's all being run through MISHDA, and folks can go online through the SARA portal to apply, and it requires a tenant application as well as a landlord application. So, and it can help with 12 to 15 months of rental back rent that's owed, as well as future rent assistance. So it's a very large grant. We are also on a tight timeline for spending the funds, so we really want people to call us.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Another question, do you have data on the recovery or reconstruct of the homes damaged, i.e. minor, moderate, major, and destroyed homes that are listed in the numbers, but how many have been rebuilt or reconstructed and how many remain?
I actually went in and pulled up the last dam failure summary that I have, and I show one chart that says that there's been 24 homes completed, 100 clients directly served. This is just through the long-term disaster recovery group. There's many more that have also been served through a combination of efforts. And then, well, it really just talks about dollars spent, but the average per household came out to about $37,000. And this is just to date. Back in April, Jen Chappell and case management might have some additional data on that. I know I see Regan and Ann on the call as well.
I would defer that to case management because they have more access to up-to-date information and data on that.
I don't know, one of our case managers, I know we have a couple case managers on the call. I don't know if you're able to access, but I'll just pause if one of you would like to respond. And if not, we could also get that information and share after the call as well.
I'm not sure how much of that information we have just right at our fingertips. I think after the call, we could provide some of that. And we may have in the last community chat covered some of that information back in June.
Okay.
So between those two avenues, we can probably get some of that information out to whoever's interested in it.
Great. Okay, so we'll follow up with that. And then another question raised is with significant FEMA requirements for rebuild, and I think this might be actually more city township requirements, 1 foot above the 100-year flood level. This person was surprised at how many locations were still rebuilt. How many of the homes were not rebuilt because they're of the insuitability, just too much in the flood zone and not able to meet some of the rebuild requirements?
Again, we don't have access to that data. I would say that I think there's more factors at play than just the rebuild requirements and the FEMA requirements. I believe one statistic that was shared early on was that only about 8% of all insurance claims were approved. So I think that has had a hindrance in some rebuilding. The FEMA dollars, I do believe in case management, can correct me if I'm wrong, that if you do utilize the FEMA resources, you are required to then carry flood insurance moving forward. And that might be a deterring factor for a lot of individuals to rebuild as well. And those are just my personal thoughts on that question. Jen or Donna or Regan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess I'll say sorry. It's kind of loud out in the hallway right now, but we're shutting the door. Okay, cool. So one thing about case management is that we're working, I mean, every situation is so case by case, and we're working with a lot of folks who may be in a situation where they're in the floodplain, but they don't have a lot of other alternatives to go elsewhere. So we're working to get their homes up to those new standards. One of my clients' home just had to be lifted about 5 feet in the air. Now we're not worried that place is ever going to flood again, But I don't think we have data to represent how that's happening across the county as a whole in our little area of case management, because we're working with people that are facing all these series of barriers. But I do know that I'm working with about 5 households right now, I would say, that are in a situation where we need to get them up to the new substantial damage requirements, and like the new current codes, and raising them up above the floodplain. And some people have flood insurance that's covering a lot of that. And maybe that's when we can, it's so case by case, but we're hopeful that if those code restrictions through Eagle and FEMA and at the city and county level aren't presenting barriers to people's recovery. So we are working to try and get people back in their homes if they're facing those situations.
Great, thank you.
I'd add really quick, we don't have anyone with the City of Midland on the call, but I know that they've also worked on a program that they've done previously where they actually help homeowners move out of the floodplain. I forget exactly what that's called, but City of Midland is absolutely working on a program like that.
And this one might go along a little bit with this. How many homes are still vacant? Because this person commented that they have several vacant homes in their neighborhood. How many homes are still vacant from the flood? Do we have any idea of that, or has data collection been done on that specific piece?
I don't believe that's a data point that we have, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Additional questions? Okay, I don't see anything new coming through chat right now. So last chance here, last chance for your questions with this wonderful panel. And some of our case managers on the line as well, so.
Hello, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm Bob Przbilski from Delta College Public Media, and we did the breach documentary that aired a while ago on the flood. And we're working on part 2, which is kind of called recovery. And I'm just wondering if we were to highlight something from what you guys are doing in Midland County about the housing and getting people back into homes, what would that be? What should we be? I mean, because we're focusing on Wixom and Sanford Lake area, but we don't want to ignore Midland. So we're trying to figure out what in Midland do we need to talk about? So maybe you can help us figure something out.
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that. And by the way, kudos on the incredible job on that breach documentary. If you've not seen it, those of you on the line, I highly encourage you to view that. I would suggest connecting with our disaster case managers. I think that they will have some wonderful stories to tell, and I can give you their number, and then you
Okay.
can follow up and they could decide, who would be best equipped to talk with you. But their number is 989-374-8000. 989-374-8000. Because with their individual work with families, individuals impacted by this, I think they will have a really nice scope of some of the things going on really throughout the area and county and even region to some extent. But I think specifically if you're looking at the City of Midland, through their work, they would be able to share with you some of their experiences there.
Okay, we have contacted them, but we haven't really heard back from them in a while. So that, that was the track we were on. So if you think that's the one we should continue, then we'll try again. But we just haven't been getting anything back from them, and maybe they're really busy or whatever the case may be. But we were kind of looking for stuff like that, in an individual story who's rebuilding, and because we don't want to ignore Midland. So okay, then we were on the right track. So we'll just keep pushing forward, and if we're having an issue contacting them, can we contact you and maybe you can grease the wheels a little
Absolutely.
bit?
Well, I know they are, they have many cases they're working with, but we would be very happy to do a connection.
Okay, great.
So-
Thank you
so
very
feel
much.
free. Yeah, and
Thanks.
a couple other suggestions on that front, maybe also reaching out to Grant Marshall with the City of Midland Planning Department. He may have some thoughts there. And then Jennifer Boyer, the emergency manager for Midland County, may also have some additional thoughts to share with you on that.
Okay, much appreciated. Thank you.
Great. Okay, other questions or? All right, well, I want to thank you all for being a part of today's call. And I did want to, again, reinforce some important resources available. The disaster case managers, again, 989-374-8000. I'd also refer you to reliefmidland.org or our 211, just as simple as a call to 211 will open up the door to many resources and connections. So I encourage you, if you know of those that are looking for resources and assistance, to please refer them to those resources. Again, as a reminder, you can find a recording of this soon to come on the Relief Midland website or also Midland Area Community Foundation website, as well as past programs that we've had as a part of this. And I will mention that the last program did talk about the large FEMA grant coming to our region and the various ways that is going to be utilized to help with support for flood recovery and our flood survivors. Our next session will be on August 12th at 10:30 a.m. We encourage you to please register in advance. This will focus on the work of the Infrastructure Committee. So an Infrastructure Committee has been established for this area, and they're looking at various ways to mitigate flooding for the future. They're working with the Army Corps of Engineers. So there'll be some interesting information shared on that on August 12th. So again, thank you for joining us for this flood recovery session. And special thanks to Jennifer Chappell, Jen Acosta, and Donna St. John's for speaking today. And also thank you for Reagan for jumping in and sharing as well from the case management perspective. I really appreciate all of the expertise, the time that's been invested. And again, kudos to the work of our long-term disaster recovery group, who continues to meet on an ongoing monthly basis to continue flood recovery as we continue to move forward here in this community and region from the impact of May of 2020. So thank you all for joining. Have a great rest of your day.